Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hybrid Cloud Security Summit. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, Virtualization Cloud Review, and AWS Insider, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, enterprise cloud platform provider Nutanix, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the first of three information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It will be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our team reads every comment, and they help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving, wait for it, a $1,000 American Express gift card. Wow. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Hybrid Cloud Security Infrastructure Do's, Don'ts, and Gotchas. And for this session, we've called on scientist, author, and 20-time Microsoft MVP, Brian Posey. Brian has written thousands of articles about information technology and contributed to dozens of books and video training courses. He writes the popular Posey's Tips and Tricks column for Redmond Magazine, as well as the must-read Posey's Moonshot, through which he shares his commercial astronaut training experiences. You're in for a great session, as always. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, John. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everybody. You know, I hadn't really planned on saying this or anything, but I was just thinking I really wish that you all could have been tuned into some of the chatter that was going on before the conference. John was talking about the potential for self-aware AI. It was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Might make for a good webcast one day. You never know. At any rate, today we're going to be talking all about hybrid cloud security. And this is one of those that was a super difficult topic to put together because hybrid cloud security is difficult. It's one of those things that seems so simple in concept, and yet the devil is in the details. So what is it that makes hybrid cloud so difficult to secure? Well, there are any number of things. And one of the things that's super obvious and yet no less important is that hybrid clouds are complex. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, how many boxes do you have on premises, and how many services are running on those boxes? What does your control plane look like? You know, there are all these components just on the on-premises side, never mind all of the external resources that exist in public clouds. And typically those are multi-vendor solutions that are cobbled together. And that in itself is another challenge because every vendor out there has its own established best practices. And those best practices don't always mesh well with one another. I mean, sure, sometimes you can have a solution that is vendor-specific. For example, maybe your on-premises portion of your hybrid cloud is running all Microsoft and your public cloud portion is all Azure. You know, that's great, and it would probably work really well. The same thing with, say, you've got a VMware cloud or VMware-based hybrid cloud. You're running VMware on-premises, you're using the VMware cloud, everything's great. But what I've often seen in the real world is that organizations will start out that way where they're using one vendor solution, but over time, other components from other vendors start making their way into the picture. Maybe there is a less expensive way of running some particular service in the hybrid cloud, and that leads to another vendor solution being brought in. That's certainly one possibility. Another is that perhaps another vendor offers a better best-of-breed solution as an alternative to a service that you're currently running on a different cloud. That's another reason why a multi-vendor environment might come into play. And then, of course, there can be pressures within the organization. Maybe somebody in upper management has an attachment to some particular cloud service and is insisting on you running that, or maybe a client is demanding that you run their stuff on a particular platform. The point is there are any number of reasons why a cloud that starts out as being a single vendor environment can suddenly morph into this really unwieldy, complex multi-vendor environment. And that's something that has to be taken into account when we start talking about cloud security. Now, one of the big complexities that comes into play with that is that sometimes when you've got these multi-vendor environments where you're leveraging multiple vendor solutions on premises and multiple public clouds, is that sometimes things don't play nice together. And even if they do, you may find that certain services aren't officially supported for working together. And even if those services actually are supported and they do work, you may find that certain vendors really aren't that wild about you using another vendor solution. So they go a little, shall we say, sparse on the documentation, just as kind of a way of saying, hey, we're not going to stop you from doing this, but we'd really rather you didn't. So just something to think about. But all of that is to say that the combination of vendor solutions tends to lead to the complexity involved in securing the hybrid cloud environment. And then the last one on this list is that every hybrid cloud is different. The one I'm using, I guarantee, is different from the one you're using. You know, it's just part of it. And the reason why that's important is because it means that there's no checklist that you can go through to cover all your bases as far as security. And that was actually one of the things that made it so difficult to put this webcast together, is because typically when I'm asked to speak on a topic, what I like to do is just come up with a list of actionable items that I can give to you and you can take away and do it in your own environment. You know, if I were talking about security for some specific product, it might be, hey, here's 10 things you can do right now and 2 or 3 things that you absolutely should not be doing, and take this and go put them to work in your own environment. That's great. I can't really do that with hybrid cloud because everybody's environments are so different. So the best practices that might be suitable for my environment might not necessarily be the best practices for your own environment. So having said that, I think the best way to approach this topic is to, rather than giving you very specific best practices, is to instead give you things that you should be thinking about as you work toward better securing your hybrid cloud environment. So that's where we're going to go with this presentation. Yes, I'm going to give you some really general best practices that you can use, but more than that, I want to try to give you some things that you should think about as you work to secure your own environments. So the first recommendation that I would make when it comes to securing hybrid clouds is to focus on foundational elements, because every public cloud, every hybrid cloud, no matter how simple or how complex, is made up of individual building blocks. So the very first thing that you should do is focus on those building blocks that make up the cloud. If you can secure that, then maybe that doesn't handle everything, but you're a good ways into the overall goal of securing your environment. So what are some areas to focus on? Well, I would recommend starting out with manageability. There's an old saying that says that you can't secure what you can't manage. So give some serious thought into how you're currently managing your hybrid cloud environment. Also, take a look at observability. What are you able to see in your hybrid cloud environment? Now, obviously, every public cloud provider has things that they do behind the curtain that they don't let their customers see. That's a given. But what tools are available to you to see what's really going on behind the scenes, particularly from a security and operational standpoint? And then identity. This is another big one. Identity referring to how your users' identities travel between your public cloud environments, especially if you're using multiple public clouds, and your on-premises private cloud environment. And I'll be getting into identity quite a bit more a little bit later in the presentation. So where do I even begin with all of this? Well, what I want you to do is go through a little thought exercise and pretend that rather than having been working for the company that you're with for however long you've been there, pretend that you're brand new and this is day one, and that whoever worked there before you made an absolute mess out of the organization's hybrid cloud, and that you were hired to clean up that mess and to figure out how to secure it. Now, I know that most of you listening have probably been with your jobs for quite some time, and that this little thought exercise seems completely ridiculous. I get it. Believe me, I do. But the reason why I mention this thought exercise is this is something that I tend to do myself quite often. Because if you can put yourself in the thought process of an outsider, you tend to look at things a lot more objectively. things that you would normally take for granted, you begin to question. And that can go a long way toward helping you to figure out where the flaws are within a given architecture and where any security vulnerabilities might exist. And then once you've identified those vulnerabilities, then you can begin to work on solutions for overcoming those vulnerabilities and addressing that which needs to be addressed. So the basic idea behind this procedure is to go in with zero assumption about anything and then start asking yourself rhetorical questions about what resources exist, how those resources are fit together, what permissions exist, and that sort of thing until you begin to gain a better picture and understanding of how everything fits together. Now, obviously, a lot of this you already know, because if you work with something every day, then obviously you know what resources make it up. But I still believe that going through the process of rhetorically asking yourself what resources exist, what permissions exist, and that sort of thing is worthwhile because it really gets you into that mindset of what can you do to better secure that hybrid cloud environment. So let's move forward and take a look at some of the rhetorical questions that you might ask yourself as a part of this process. So first one, really simple question, what public clouds are being used? That's a really, really simple question to answer. Next, are multiple tenants being used within the individual public clouds and why? Back before the world shut down, and I'm not going to name names here or anything, but I went to a live event, and the speaker was very adamant that there is absolutely no excuse for using a multi-tenant environment. He was really driving that point home. I disagree with this. I think that there are several justifiable reasons for using multi-tenancy when it comes to public cloud. But the question is not whether that speaker believes you shouldn't or whether I believe that there are justifiable reasons. The real question is your own organization using multiple tenants? And if so, is the reason why that's being done justifiable? Because remember, multi-tenant environments have advantages and disadvantages. One advantage, and probably the biggest one, is that it creates some really nice, strong security isolation boundaries. When used properly, multi-tenancy can have enormous security benefits, and it can really help you with your compliance efforts. When used improperly, however, those same multi-tenancies can create blind spots with regard to your ability to manage and monitor your hybrid cloud environment. So I certainly wouldn't tell anybody you should never, ever use multi-tenancy. What I would say is that if you are using multi-tenancy, make sure that it's justified and make sure that the proper controls are in place that will allow you to manage and monitor it. The next question, which services are being used within which public clouds? Again, this sounds like one of those really obvious questions, but the answer might not be quite as obvious as you think. Let's say, for example, that an organization has a hybrid cloud in place that's used primarily for hosting virtual machines. Now, I get it. There are lots of other things that tend to be done with hybrid clouds as well, but we'll just keep things simple and focus on virtual machines for right now. So if that were the case, you've probably got an on-premises environment running Hyper-V and or VMware. And in the cloud, you might be running something like Azure Virtual Machines, maybe EC2 if you're on the Amazon cloud, something like that. And then maybe some backend storage services where the virtual machine files reside. Simple enough. But when you really start digging into it, what you might find is that there are some other services that are being used, or even if they're not currently being used, they were provisioned at one point for a particular project and then eventually abandoned, and yet those services are still up and running in the cloud. Those are the things that you need to be watching out for, because those unused services or services that could be retired and rolled into something else, for one thing, they're costing you money because, remember, in the cloud you're paying for the resources that you use. But for another, they represent an attack surface. So anything that you can do to consolidate your cloud footprint is only a good thing, especially from a security perspective. So as you go through and you inventory the services that you're using in the cloud, you might find that, okay, I've got all this infrastructure for running virtual machines, but, oh, by the way, I've got this Cosmos database over here that was used 3 years ago and hasn't been touched since, or something like that. So, just something to be on the lookout for. So another question to consider is, what does your on-premises infrastructure look like? And I won't go into too much detail on this one because I want to focus more on the public cloud side, but consider what infrastructure components you've got in place, and if there are any changes that need to be made there. Maybe there are things you can do to to achieve better physical security. Maybe you've got some outdated hardware that needs to be brought up to date. Just take a look at what your physical infrastructure looks like and if any changes need to be made. From there, consider what workloads are running on premises versus which workloads are running in public clouds. And then consider why are the workloads in those locations. Presumably there's a reason. And, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. Certainly some workloads are better suited to running on premises and others may be better suited to running in the public cloud. But just make sure that where you're running workloads really makes sense for that particular workload. And I get it that that's more of a performance issue than a security issue. But when you really start drilling down into things, workload placement does sometimes become a security issue. So it's important to get all of this down and start thinking about how these types of things could potentially affect your overall security. So what else? What kinds of workloads are you running? Obviously, there's probably applications, but even if we just stay away from that and focus on more generic things, are you running containers? Are those containers hosting microservices or using virtual machines? Some combination of the three? What are you using and why? And are those the appropriate roles for those individual elements? And then the last one on this slide is, do you have a self-service environment in place? Because a lot of organizations that use hybrid clouds will put in place self-service environments that allow users to deploy certain resources on an as-needed basis. Maybe a user is able to create new virtual machines when they need a virtual machine to handle a particular task. So self-service environments really aren't all that uncommon. But the important thing is to take a look at who's authorized to use it, what quotas are in place, and what's the justification of having that. So what does this have to do with security? Well, a couple of things. One is that when you've got a self-service environment, you've presumably got certain users who are authorized to use it. You need to consider, are those users justified in using it? Do they have a job responsibility that really dictates them having the need to do whatever it is the self-service environment is designed to do, such as deploying new virtual machines? So that's a big consideration, particularly from a security and compliance standpoint, because you always have to think about what would happen if that user's account were to become compromised. Another thing to think about, though, is what controls are in place to limit what that user is able to do in that self-service environment. Now, on the surface, this one sounds like a weird question, particularly if the self-service environment is single task. Maybe you've got an environment where authorized users are able to create virtual machines and you've got a handful of templates that they can choose from, so everything's predefined and they can't get in there and do anything too crazy. That's great. That's exactly the way that should be set up. But here's the thing. Sometimes provisioning resources in hybrid clouds can be almost like a denial of service attack. So let's say for a moment that you've got a user who gets a little overzealous, and they go in and they create a huge number of virtual machines in your on-premises environment, and all of a sudden you're out of virtualization resources. Well, that wasn't an attack that was malicious in nature. It didn't come from the outside world, and yet it's behaving very similarly to a denial of service attack, simply because that user ended up depleting the resources that you had available in your on-premises environment. So it's really important to make sure that you've got the appropriate controls and quotas in place to keep things like that from happening. Another really important consideration when it comes to securing your hybrid cloud environment is how user identities are managed across the environments. So you've got to think about what's working right now, what isn't working, if you've got any identity-related challenges that need to be addressed, and what you're really doing to make sure that only authorized users are accessing your hybrid cloud workloads. Now, that last point, that sounds like another really generic one, but what I'm really referring to here is what are you doing to prove user identities? Okay, a user logs on with their username and password, and then they've got a certain list of permissions that they're authorized to act on. That's great. That's a great start. But what can you do to better ensure that those users are who they claim to be? Maybe this means enabling multi-factor authentication. Maybe this means putting some controls in place with your help desk so that when a user calls for a password reset, there's a better system in place of verifying that user's identity before you change that user's password, just as a way of helping to prevent social engineering attacks that seek to gain access to your resources through a password reset. So there are any number of things that you can be doing to help make sure that your users are who they claim to be so that only authorized users are gaining access to those cloud resources. So another question to consider is, what tools are you using to manage your hybrid cloud environments? And are those tools working for you? Is there something that maybe isn't working as well as it needs to be and could be improved upon by maybe using a different tool? Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, there was an organization that I did some work for quite a few years back, and I'm trying to be careful about what I'm saying here because I don't want to accidentally disclose this organization's identity or the name of this particular tool. But this organization had a particular management tool that they were using, and it was really kind of funny because the management there was really proud of this tool because they had spent an absolute fortune for it, and apparently they had jumped through all kinds of hoops to get it in there and deployed and all that. But the actual IT frontline workers absolutely hated this tool. The thing never worked right. Services and agents that it depended on were constantly shutting down without reason. And the thing was so overcomplicated that you practically needed a PhD in computer science to be able to use it. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it was way overcomplicated. So this is an example of a tool that, has all of the right specifications for getting the job done, and yet in practice, it just isn't working. So that's the type of thing that I'm talking about needs to be looked at in your hybrid cloud environment. Do you have tools like this that maybe look good on paper but aren't getting the job done? Because remember what I talked about earlier, you can't secure what you can't manage. So it's really, really important to have a good management platform in place that will allow you to see and manage all of the various aspects of your hybrid cloud environment. Also, is there anything that you can do to reduce the number of management tools that you're using? The caveat to that, of course, being that you don't want to reduce your tool set in a way that's going to compromise your ability to manage the environment. But maybe you've got some overlap between some of the tools that you use, and there are certain tools that you can get rid of and kind of simplify the way that the environment is managed. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because, remember, every management tool has the potential to act as an attack target. So anything that you can do to reduce the amount of software that's being used, even when we're talking about management tools, has the added effect of reducing the attack surface. And it can also bring down your cost, too, because you've got licenses that you no longer have to worry about. While we're on the subject of tools, another thing to consider is what tools are being used or can you acquire for the purposes of performing root cause analytics. Because one of the things about hybrid cloud environments is that things are a lot more complex than they were when you were just running everything on premises. Because oftentimes you'll have some resources in the cloud, some resources on site, and there's all these complex interdependencies between workloads. So when something does go wrong, it can be really tough to troubleshoot the problem, and there are some really great third-party tools out there that can look at the entire hybrid cloud stack and help to pinpoint what service or element it is that broke down that's causing the problem that you're experiencing. It can really reduce the amount of effort involved in the troubleshooting process, which helps problems to be remediated a lot more quickly and can thereby drive down cost when an outage does occur. And then finally, the last one on the list is what mechanisms are being used to control cost. And as I pointed out earlier, this can actually be a potential security issue in terms of denial of service. Because think about a public cloud environment. You've got resources that are being run, and you're paying for every resource that's being consumed. You're paying for every CPU cycle. You're paying for the storage IOPS and any other resource that you happen to use out there. So imagine for a moment that an attacker somehow manages to gain access to your environment. And rather than launching a conventional attack, maybe they just spin up a couple of new virtual machines, really large virtual machines. And all of a sudden, these billing controls that you've got into place kick in because they realize that, hey, you've exceeded your cost quota for this month, and we're going to shut everything down to prevent excessive billing. Well, when that happens, what that attacker has effectively done is launched a denial of service attack based on cost, because they know you've probably got these cost controls in place, and that if they can just do something to incur additional cost, then everything is going to come to a grinding halt because of those cost controls. So I'm not saying don't use cost controls. I use them myself. They play a very important role. You need to know what your cloud services are costing you. But what I am saying is to be careful about how you use them, and just know that they can be a double-edged sword. In the right circumstances, those cost controls can act as a denial of service tool. Okay, so another question to consider with regard to securing your hybrid cloud environment is, how are you maintaining an inventory of the resources that are being used in that environment? And is that inventory current? So that's another really important question, because you've got to keep track of what resources actually exist within your hybrid cloud environments. Because if you don't know what resources are supposed to be there, then you won't necessarily be able to spot it when something abnormal appears. So it's a very, very important consideration. Also, how are you auditing resource usage, and what about user rights assignments? What do users actually have rights to? And then the big question, and the reason I say this is the big one is because it has implications for security across the board, is who has access to what, and is that access justified? So hopefully I've given you a lot of things to think about with regard to hybrid cloud security. So with that said, I want to change the focus of the presentation just a little bit, and rather than just listing off a whole bunch of rhetorical questions for you to think about in your own environments, I want to get into a little bit of strategy and talk about some things that you can actually be doing in order to secure your hybrid cloud environment. Now, these strategy items are somewhat generic because, as I said at the very beginning, every hybrid cloud environment is different, and what applies to mine might not necessarily apply to yours. So you always want to look at established best practices for the cloud elements that you're using. But I do want to give you some things to think about with regard to strategy. So let's go ahead and get into it. First strategy is to remember that identity is the new perimeter. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the old days, the way that we operated was we had these data centers on premises, and if you could make it so that the bad guys couldn't get into that data center and none of your information could leave the data center, you were doing a great job. You were doing what needed to be done. So the idea was that this data center had 4 walls, and those 4 walls acted as your perimeter. You kept the bad guys from coming in. You kept anything inside from leaving. That's what the perimeter was all about. Well, this model doesn't really hold up anymore. The perimeter, for all practical purposes, has completely evaporated. I mean, think about it for a moment. Instead of having all of our applications running in a data center, they're scattered around who knows where. You've presumably got some applications that are still running on premises, but you've also got applications that are running in one or more public clouds. The same thing can also be said for network endpoints. I'm talking about like the devices that users work from. You know, the last couple of years, everybody's been working remotely. So whereas you may have at one time had everybody working on site from domain-joined corporate desktops, now everybody's using these devices that are of a huge variety, oftentimes privately owned, and users are working from who knows where. People aren't working locally in the corporate office anymore. And I could go on and on with other examples, but the point is that the network perimeter has evaporated. So defending at the perimeter doesn't really make sense anymore, and it hasn't for a while. So if you can't defend the network perimeter, what do you defend? Well, the next logical thing to defend is user identities. Because really, when a user signs in, that identity is what gets them access to the various resources that they've been granted access to. So this is why I say identity is the new perimeter. So how can we act on that? What can be done in a hybrid cloud environment around identities? Well, one of the things that I would recommend, and this one is a tall order, especially if you've already got a hybrid cloud environment in place and it's working for you, but the idea, at least from a best practices standpoint, is to begin to standardize around your identities that you're using. So what I'm talking about is making identities portable across clouds, whether we're talking public clouds, private clouds, or what have you. And there are any number of different ways that you can achieve this. One option, and the option that I tend to gravitate toward, is to use cloud-based directory services. So what do I mean by that? Well, in an on-premises environment, that means deploying a bunch of domain controllers and running the Active Directory services on them. Simple enough. If you're using the Azure cloud, there's always Azure AD. Azure AD has been around for years, and that's Microsoft's preferred directory solution. But having said that, you're not limited to only using Active Directory in Microsoft environments. There are ways of doing it even on non-Microsoft clouds. For example, Amazon will allow you to deploy directory services as a managed service. So what you can do is you can actually go out and deploy a directory in the Amazon cloud. You can do it with probably a dozen mouse clicks, and then you wait about an hour or so, and next thing you know, you've got a fully provisioned Active Directory environment running in the Amazon cloud. And because it's running as a managed service, you don't have to worry about doing anything to set up domain controllers or anything like that. All that happens behind the scenes. But the interesting thing about that is that you have the ability to connect that managed Active Directory environment to your on-premises Active Directory environment or to Azure AD or to any other Active Directory instances that you might be using. There are even ways that you can set up trust relationships if need be. So that's one approach for managing identities across the cloud. Another approach that is a little bit more convoluted but might be easier from people who tend to come from an on-premises background is that you can just set up cloud-based domain controllers. You set up virtual machines in the cloud, you run the Active Directory domain services on them, and then you've got cloud-based Active Directory environments. Now, there's a lot that you have to worry about if you do use that approach. For example, you've got to make sure that you stay up to date with patching all of your virtual machines. And it's also super important to make sure that you put the Active Directory site structure in place. Otherwise, you can have users who are authenticating to domain controllers that are who knows where within your cloud environment. So if you use the virtualized domain controller approach, you've absolutely got to make sure that you build the appropriate Active Directory site structure around that. And there are plenty of similar best practices with regard to Active Directory in the cloud. And then, of course, there were also other alternatives. I'm talking about things like LDAP and Radius and so on and so forth. So what else can we be doing? Well, another thing that you can do strategy-wise is work toward adopting zero trust principles in your hybrid cloud environment. Now, one of the big tricks about this is remember the point that I've been underscoring throughout this entire presentation is that you absolutely have to focus on manageability. You can't secure what you can't manage. So the reason why this is so important is because every public cloud provider has their own unique feature set. Yes, there are things that the various providers all have in common with one another, but remember, each public cloud provider is trying to one-up all of the other providers by offering things that the other providers just don't have as a way of luring customers. So this is great from the standpoint of that it leads to a lot of innovation and it gives you the opportunity to adopt best-of-breed solutions. But the problem is that from a security standpoint, you can end up with security mechanisms that exist in one public cloud but not in another. And when you're working to adopt zero trust, it can be tempting to take advantage of all of the latest security solutions that may exist, but you can end up in a situation where some of these security services only exist in one of the clouds that you're using. So my recommendation would be to err on the side of consistency rather than on the side of having access to all of the latest security mechanisms, and try to focus on using security mechanisms that exist in all of the environments that you're using. So rather than adopting that really niche security solution, focus on using things that exist across the board and are going to be easier to manage. Now, having said that, I realize that sometimes cloud providers have security systems that do similar things, but they'll have different names and work in slightly different ways. You know, that's okay because usually something like that, it's easy enough to translate across the different environments and achieve similar functionality. What I'm talking about is features that are just radically different in one cloud versus another or that just don't exist in other clouds. So another strategy item is look for ways that you might be able to reduce complexity. So from a hybrid cloud standpoint, this can mean any number of things. For starters, look for services that you can remove. Are there old services out there that were provisioned at one time and were once being used but aren't needed anymore? Maybe you can turn those services off as a way of cutting cost and reducing the attack surface. Certainly, that's one big strategy that you can use for making your environment more secure. Also, are there workloads that you can consolidate? Now, having said that, everything comes with a balance. There's an old saying that just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should, and that absolutely applies here. Just because it's possible to consolidate a workload doesn't necessarily mean that you should consolidate that workload. You have to do what's best for your organization, not just from the standpoint of security, but also from the standpoint of service availability and performance. So it may not always make sense to consolidate a workload, but if there's a way to consolidate workloads without causing performance issues or stability issues or availability issues or things like that, then you may be able to achieve better overall security by going ahead and doing that workload consolidation. This is one of those things that's really going to differ on a case-by-case basis. And another one, can you decrease the number of regions that you're using? This is another one of those things where, on the surface, decreasing the number of regions that you're using sounds like a direct violation of best practices, and I guess in some ways it is. But there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. I've seen situations where really small organizations are spanning resources across way, way, way more regions than they really need to in the name of redundancy. Sometimes it's okay to cut back on a little bit of that redundancy as long as you've got your bases covered, just in the name of bringing down cost and reducing the potential attack surface. So it's all about just achieving that appropriate balance for your own organization. So another strategy item is, are there any manual processes that you can automate? I'm really big into automation. I tend to be a PowerShell junkie, but when viewed from a security standpoint, there are several advantages to automation. For one thing, having automated processes in place eliminates the risks of human error, because you know that script that performs that automated routine is going to behave the same way every single time that it runs. So let's say, for example, let's say you've got a script that just provisions new users. You use that script for user onboarding. Well, it's going to work through the same steps for onboarding new users every single time that it runs. And you don't have to worry about key things being omitted. And that means that users aren't accidentally going to be receiving permissions that they don't need. It means that they're not going to be accidentally denied access to an application that they really should have access to. It just simplifies everything. Now, obviously, removing the potential for human errors is a huge advantage in favor of automation, but it's not the only thing that automation can do for you. Automation also reduces the opportunity for a rogue administrator to cause harm. Now, rogue administration is one of those things that we tend to read about in security textbooks, but I can tell you I've seen this several times in the real world. It absolutely does happen. Unfortunately, I've had more experiences with that than I really care to think about. But think about this from a security standpoint. There's a big difference between giving an administrator access to perform all of these different granular tasks versus giving that same administrator access to run a script that will perform those same tasks on their behalf. Sometimes, if you structure things correctly, you can give an individual administrator fewer rights while still allowing them to perform the same job simply by using automation. Automation is also nice from an auditing and compliance standpoint because it makes your logs a lot easier to read. Rather than seeing, okay, this administrator did this, you get one entry. This administrator ran the script. So you can really simplify things through automation, and you can make your logs easier to digest. So just a few things to think about. So another strategy item is adhere to established best practices for the on-premises portion of your cloud. Now, this one kind of goes without saying, but it's important, so I wanted to go ahead and mention it. The idea behind this is that anytime you have an on-premises deployment, there are certain best practices that go along with that. And that holds true whether we're talking about a hybrid cloud environment or whether we're just talking about a standard standalone environment. There are going to be certain things like make sure that you keep all of your patches up to date. Make sure that you're practicing least user access. Make sure that you're practicing good physical security. There are all of these things that are best practices for security in on-premises environments. And those best practices don't go away just because you've deployed a hybrid cloud. They become even more important than ever. So make sure that you're adhering to any documented best practices for the on-premises portion of your hybrid environment. Another strategy item is to leverage auditing, monitoring, and alerting. Now, this one can be tough, especially if you're in a multi-vendor environment, because each vendor has their own way of doing things. But there are some really good third-party solutions out there that will perform log file aggregation. So it will ingest the log files from all of these different sources, and then it will perform automated log file analytics in a way that will spot potential security incidents or issues that could eventually become problems, and then it can alert you to those issues. Now, if you're going to use something like this, then one of the big things that you need to watch out for is filtering on the alerting, because sometimes alerting can be set up in a way that you end up with alert fatigue. The software is alerting you about absolutely everything and stuff that doesn't even have any relevance to the real world. And it's a lot better to just have fewer alerts and be notified of the things that really matter rather than being alerted to every little thing, because when you start being alerted to every little thing that occurs, the alerts start to become meaningless and it becomes way too easy to ignore them. So that's why I say that you should tone down the alerts if you can. Another best practice is to adopt least privilege access. The basic idea behind this is that users shouldn't have access to anything that's not absolutely required for their jobs. This is another one of those zero trust principles that comes into play. And aside from being useful for zero trust, it's often essential to use least privilege access in organizations that are required to comply with compliance mandates. And it can also help to reduce your risks of malware, because when a user accidentally unleashes a malware attack, that malware runs under the user's security context. So whatever that user has access to, that's what the malware has access to. So if you use least privilege access and you cut down on what the user can potentially access, you also cut down on what malware could potentially damage. Also, least privilege access isn't just for users. Yes, you should make sure that your users don't have access to anything that they don't absolutely need. But the same thing also applies to your applications, whether those applications are running in the on-premises portion of your hybrid cloud or in the public cloud portion. Because very often, and I would say actually most of the time, applications run under service accounts. And those service accounts give the application specific permissions. The problem is if you start using the same service account for multiple applications, then you can end up with what's called permission stacking. And applications can begin to accumulate permissions that they don't actually need. And then that can lead to a situation where if that particular application is compromised, then the attacker can use those permissions and go out and attack other things. So it's really important to make sure that your applications don't have access to anything that they don't need. And then finally, zero trust isn't just for your users. You should also apply the zero trust principles to any devices on your network. And I'm not just talking about endpoint devices. I'm also talking about servers or virtual machines that are running in your hybrid cloud environment. Because just because you have a new virtual server that pops up in your hybrid cloud environment doesn't mean that you should automatically trust it. I mean, really, you don't know where that virtual server came from. Yes, it exists in your hybrid cloud, and yes, more than likely it was created by an authorized user. But unless you really go in and audit that virtual machine, you don't know for sure who created it, why it was created, or where it came from. So you shouldn't just automatically trust it. And one way that I would sum all of this up in my entire philosophy behind hybrid cloud security is to use the Las Vegas gaming table model. The way that they do things in Vegas is that they've got all of these table games, all the different card games that you see when you're walking through the casinos. And the dealers deal games in very, very specific ways. And the idea is that these specific ways are designed to be uniform so that the security people are watching the dealers deal a game, and if the dealers do anything that breaks this really rigidly established protocol, then that action that the dealer took is going to stand out because it's different from what is normally done. Well, the same principle can be applied to your hybrid cloud security. If you exercise security in a very regimented way and you adhere to well-documented practices, then anything that is abnormal is going to stand out and it's going to be easier to spot. So that's one of the key philosophies that I always recommend when it comes to IT security. And this is also one of the reasons why it's so important to practice unified management, using that third-party tool that can manage all of your resources in the same way, regardless of whether they're on premises or in one of the public clouds that you use. Consistent management experiences through a unified set of tools will help you to better utilize this Las Vegas gaming table model that I'm talking about. So with that said, I'm just about out of time. I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you. The Las Vegas gaming table model. Fascinating. Okay, let's see here. Let me grab my note. Okay. I just want to remind everybody that there's still plenty of time to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'd be glad to do our very best to get to all of them. We've definitely got some time here. And I want to remind you that our sponsor, Nutanix, has provided some extra resources on the right-hand side of your screen. Be sure and check those out. Okay, let's go ahead and start with this first one from Key. Let's see. Where do you envision IAM fitting into hybrid cloud security?
IAM is really important because that's what associates cloud user accounts with the permissions that those accounts receive. But the thing that you have to keep in mind is that IAM has a very specific use case. So let's say that you've deployed an Active Directory environment in your cloud. Those Active Directory users aren't necessarily going to have corresponding IAM accounts. So IAM tends to be used a lot more for low-level permissions within the cloud, whereas the Active Directory that you're running across cloud environments is more used for assigning users permission to the various resources that they use.
Okay. So if you had to pick one, what are the main benefits, I guess you could say, to reducing the number of public cloud providers you are using?
Well, reducing the number of providers isn't necessarily the best course of action in every situation, but let's say that you do decide that that's going to be in the best interest of your organization. One of the big benefits is that it can help bring down your cost because you're not going to be running redundant services on multiple clouds. And it's also going to simplify management because it's a lot easier to find a management tool that works with, the one cloud that you're using and your on-premises environment than to find a management tool that works across multiple public clouds and your private cloud. So it's just going to make everything a little bit less expensive and a little bit easier to manage. Oh, and one more thing.
So Mark, I'm sorry, let me interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, and one more thing. What I had talked about earlier about trying to be consistent with regard to the security mechanisms that you use and trying to only use mechanisms that are available in each one of the clouds that you use. Well, if you reduce the number of clouds that you're using, you open up the possibility of using more of those security features that maybe they don't exist within the cloud that you cut loose, but they do exist in the clouds that you're continuing to use. So you might actually be able to take advantage of more features that way.
So Mark is wondering, are there any management tools that you would recommend?
I kind of have to be careful with that one because, we all have sponsors and things like that. But let's just say that there are some really good ones out there, and they're not overly difficult to find. If you just search on hybrid cloud management, you'll definitely find some tools. They're pretty well known and easy to find out there. I wish I could give you a more direct answer than that, but I have to be careful about this.
Understood. So Sean is wondering, follow up to a previous question, isn't reducing the number of public cloud providers used similar to vendor lock?
Yeah, in some ways it's absolutely similar to that, but there is one key difference. When you end up in a vendor lock situation, the vendor basically owns you because you're tied into, a long-term licensing agreement and you're using, that vendor's products and they tend not to work with anything else. Well, when we start talking about clouds, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from bringing another cloud provider online if you decide to do so. Let's say that for whatever reason you stop using, I don't know, the AWS cloud. I'm just throwing one out there at random. And then 6 months down the road you decide that that's not working for you. There's nothing stopping you from reopening that AWS account and starting to use those services once again. So you're not really locked in the way that you are with a true vendor lock situation.
Fascinating. Okay. Excuse me. I think that's all the questions we've got for this round. Let's see. So I guess we're going to take a short break now. We'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session. Brian, thank you so much for an awesome session.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to start with the second session. Is going to be top best practices for securing and recovering enterprise hybrid clouds, led by the dynamic duo Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist for AWS Solutions, and moderated by my colleague and likely sentient AI, David Rammel, who leads the amazing editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review. Come on, no human reporter is that good. In any event,
that's going to be a good session.
Now is a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsors. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away a $1,000 American Express gift card. But you must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and, of course, our sponsor, Nutanix, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of the summit called Top Best Practices for Securing and Recovering Enterprise Hybrid Clouds. Our speakers for this session are Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist for AWS Solutions. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications and networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John, during his more than 20 years in IT, has worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He has authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspiratory books and exec blueprints, and develops courseware for Pluralsight. Dave and John, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David, for the fantastic introduction. We're so pleased to be here. Thank you to our sponsors and attendees of the show here today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. John and I love to make these sessions interactive. So if you have any questions as we're going through some of the content and you'd like a little deeper discussion on that or just some clarification, feel free to hit us up in the Q&A pane inside of your console. So, John, this is a pretty burning topic that we have, securing our hybrid cloud infrastructure. It feels like over the last 2 years that our day jobs have changed to, securing something on a daily basis. Would you agree with that?
Oh, heck yeah, Dave. It's crazy. I often think to myself that the IT we're in now is certainly not the IT that we signed up for when we got into this journey, and that's all right. It's still a great chance to help organizations with technology, but it seems like every day once we think we've got a handle and we can focus on some of those optimization or enhancement projects that we used to, we're stopped again with a new security threat that we have to pivot and adjust to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really hope everyone enjoys our presentation today, and let's get on with the show here, John. Okay, I like to put the gold nuggets for our sessions right at the very beginning, so everyone has a lot of time to digest them. And, with the threat landscape that's out there today, no matter how good our defenses are that we put up, The bad guys operate 24 hours a day. I've said that before. And, we have to prepare. And as you always say, John, assume breach, assume that they're already in, because, there's just so many attack vectors that are out there. And I think most organizations are doing a very good job paying attention to security today. We compare this to 5 years ago. Wow, we've come a long way securing our organizations. But, there's still that chance that the bad guys can take and get in and, breach from, so many different vectors. So immutability for me takes me all the way back to the tape backup days. And even further than that, John, takes me all the way back to the floppy disk days. So if you're old enough watching this, listening to this session, and you remember what a floppy disk is, you remember there's a little tab on there, or there's a little corner that you could take and you could put a little sticker over the side, and you could make that disk read only. And so we have to think of the same mentality when we're protecting our hybrid cloud infrastructure, where, we need read-only copies of that data, immutable, something the bad guys can't get to. And so, John, are you seeing organizations adopt this today? Like, are you seeing them go back to tapes, or are there kind of alternatives from tapes today?
Well, I am seeing organizations kind of break out some of that old school mentality. Luckily, I haven't seen anybody go back to tapes because of, there's other concerns with that. But I have seen them use USB drives, much like they used to use tapes, right? So they put a backup there, and then they put that USB drive in a safety deposit box or somewhere that's disconnected. Dave, you and I have taken the approach of creating network isolation, where we turn off physical network ports or unplug a backup target, and then only physically connect or enable that device for the window where we run those backups periodically, creating kind of an offline immutable backup target. So, it's that old school mentality, but using modern technology to get the job done, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in case everyone isn't aware, the technology is really advanced with the backup vendors that are out there today. So, protecting your hyper-converged hybrid infrastructure, there are new options. You can actually get pre-configured immutable backup targets now. So these are physical appliances that live at your location. So that's great. So basically, we'll right lock those backups that are on there for a period of time. We can also offload that up to cloud storage as well. And, there's also, third-party vault providers that can take and help you with that. And, it never hurts, like John mentioned, having that USB drive with your most critical data available for you. That could be the difference of your business operating or not operating in today's threat landscape. All right, the next one that I've got, John, is that, we take backups. We're diligent as backup and DR administrators. But for me, what's the point of a backup if you never test a backup? Because I'll tell you, John, from my personal experience, there's no greater pressure on you when you're down to your last backup of something and you need to restore it and you're wondering if it's going to work or not. That kind of stuff should be tested well in advance. And so you should acquire additional infrastructure if you need. If you don't have enough infrastructure, you want to try to maybe budget for that or look at, testing some of those restores to the cloud. I don't care where it goes. I just need to make sure that when the day hits and I need that critical piece of data, it could be a $2 million spreadsheet that the sales department needs or the engineering department needs. And, they've got all of that critical data inside of there, and it's really irreplaceable. You need to test. So what are your thoughts on just kind of making sure that we test backups?
Dave, I absolutely 100, and if I could go more than 100%, I would go more than 100% agree with you. But I want to point out that, because a lot of people don't realize this, that in this year, 2022, we're starting to see a lot more activity in not just cyber insurance carrier requirements and external fiscal audit requirements, that kind of thing, but also in other areas. Say that you're a manufacturer and you have a a QS or TS type certification, or your laboratory with an A2LA certification, that kind of thing. Quality departments often have IATF. There's all these different certification standards. All those organizations and agencies are starting to build in IT infrastructure and cybersecurity requirements. They understand that you now have this hybrid cloud environment where a lot of your critical data is existing outside of your conventional perimeter, your security perimeter. And so they want to not just verify that you have protections in place, but to verify that you can prove that those protections are in place and working. So you simply saying, hey, I test my backups regularly isn't enough. They're going to want screenshots. They're going to want logs. They're going to want results. And I often tell people that they're going to want you to prove that you test each type of backup you take. So if you're backing up Exchange Online mailboxes, for instance, they want you to prove that you can restore a mailbox. They want you to prove that you can restore a file. If you're doing whole VHDX or VM backups, they want you to prove that you can restore and recover that entire server. And this is very important to the cyber insurance carriers because the longer it takes you to get back up and running after an event, a malware event, ransomware event, a cyber attack now, because we've got, the war in Ukraine changing some of the attack vectors. Any of those events, the longer it takes you, the more it costs you, and the more it costs them as the insurance carrier, their potential exposure. So they're going to start coming at you harder than ever this year and next year and beyond to prove that you have tested all of your backups regularly, so probably more than once a year, probably even more than twice a year, and that you're testing each type of backup you take. So, if you're doing SQL database backups, you need to prove that you can do a SQL database restore.
Yeah, and one of the big pieces of advice, just closing this one out, is look into automation. See if you can automate those restores either with PowerShell or something natively with your backup provider that you have. So everyone uses a different backup platform, either native in the operating system, native with your provider or third party. Just see if you can automate those testing. It's a lot less work on your DR teams, and you can pass all of those audits. So automation is also key with this. Okay, so John, we talked briefly on the other slide, and this is just kind of dovetailing into that, about some of the different offline mechanisms that we can use for protecting in the event of those cyber threats. Because remember, you have to assume breach. And so one of our favorite ones that we talk to people about is having offline DR targets. So these are ones where your data is staged. It may be a week old, but it's something that we can either offline the network port, we can shut down the server, we can turn the power off to the switches, switch ports, and so on, to make sure that somebody's not going to be able to get in out of band. Because one of the areas that a lot of organizations forget that bad guys can come inbound into your infrastructure in is your, ILO, IPMI, IDRAC, out-of-band management networks, because those are typically very poorly secured. There's typically a single password in most organizations to jump across. So virtual show of hands here, how many of those on the seminar today are using the same password for all of your out-of-band management interfaces? And if you virtually put your hand up, don't worry, we can't see. Nobody's going to take and judge you. You want to be making sure that you reduce that attack surface, and you change those passwords. You want to have random passwords throughout, just to make sure that somebody can't jump laterally, because we can do a lot of damage by taking and getting into an out-of-band management interface, scratching RAID arrays. We can mess around with firmware. We can shut down servers. We can actually do quite a bit of damage out of band. So make sure you're locking that down as well, right? And the other big one here, John, is offsite data vaults. You think of the concept of an Iron Mountain. Most large organizations have used a provider like that in the past for their physical documents, right? So physical critical documents that we need to keep for a period of time. There's offsite data vaults like that are out there, where you can also store your data. So if you're not able to do this on-prem, or you feel more comfortable with a third-party provider, all of those options are available. You just need to explore them. So these are not solutions that you need to reinvent. These are all viable solutions that are out there today. All right. So John, let's say that the event happens. Something happens and, we're trying to, protect our, key and most critical assets out there. And, we have that incident, be it fire, flood, natural disaster, what we would consider traditional DR, be it cyber threat, be it state-sponsored attack. At the end of the day, you came into the office and you got a phone call that the users on the network can't access their file share. They can't log into the domain. There's weird messages printed off on the printers asking demands for money. And now we need to get back up and running. So let's hypothetically say that we had offsite DR to a cloud provider. And with that, what are some of the things that we should think about when, we would make that transition to fail over to the cloud?
Well, so Dave, one of the first things I want to mention, and it kind of dovetails with what you were talking about during the last slide, is that you should have in place a process and procedure that is well tested to collapse your networks when your SOC notices something odd going on. And that would include any VPN tunnel to the cloud. So let's take a hypothetical and say you have your corporate headquarters and then you have 10 remote offices with VPN connections into the corporate headquarters, and you have a VPN up into your cloud, up into Azure. We'll use Azure for this example. You should have a process where you can automate collapsing all those VPN tunnels so that you can prevent spread from one network to another, and particularly from your on-prem network up into the cloud. A lot of people think that the attacks we're seeing start in the cloud and then move to the on-prem network. And Dave, I know you and I have seen the total opposite, right? It tends to be weaker protections on-prem. Somebody coming in with an infected device that plugs in inside your network and gets by things. So that seems to be the weaker end, and then it moves up into the cloud. So if you collapse everything quickly and are able to avoid anything passing up into the cloud, that protects your cloud infrastructure. And then as you've got pointed out here on the slide, if you've got authentication mechanism up there, a domain controller in the cloud where you can authenticate users, you've got resources you can restore to the cloud, you've made sure to follow best practice and not use statically assigned IP addresses for your virtual adapters on those machines or for any resource, instead relying on DNS or on reservations, right? You can very quickly recover into the cloud while you figure out how much of your on-prem infrastructure is compromised, and then bring up the uncompromised sections. And one technique I use to do this a lot is I have configurations that don't have any of the VPN tunnels for my firewalls because they're terminated firewall to firewall or VPN concentrator to VPN concentrator. And I have automation routines set so that I can fire off those automation routines and they will save those configs up into all those firewalls, which effectively drops all the tunnels instantly, much faster than I can log into a firewall, remove a tunnel, or change a key or anything, right? It happens in seconds. So that's my thoughts on this.
No, absolutely. Great points there, John. And one of the other things with the hard-coded IPs that I've found is that most failover vendors will help you change the IPs, even if they are statically assigned on those VMs. And the ones to really watch out for is if you have homegrown applications or custom applications on your network, and if you're a large organization, you've got something custom developed in there, watch out for those hard-coded IPs that are inside of there, because all of a sudden your app will break. Maybe your mail to send functions and stuff like that are breaking inside of there. John, we had a really great question come in from Kevin, and Kevin, thank you for that question. And he was asking about immutable storage snapshots. So let's say that you've got a SAN appliance or NAS, or you've got the ability to take snapshots with that appliance, and they have an option for immutability in there. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how about like an immutable storage level snapshot?
Well, Dave, and I'm just going to quickly throw in a couple thoughts in here because I know you'll have some thoughts on this, but I I tell people, take advantage of as many things as you can. Layer your defenses, right? So having more than one type of immutable technology is not a bad thing in my mind. It's a good thing. But I do caution people, particularly when it comes to anything that is software-based. So when we say it's immutable because we've configured software to structure it, remember, all cyber attacks are a compromise of software, either from something that the developer didn't know was there, so had no intention for it to be able to do what the attacker is doing, or by changing the code in some way to do it. So, in a sense, all software is vulnerable. We just don't know how it's vulnerable, and that's the basis of an attack. So I like the idea of using software immutability and then having some hardware immutability, the kind of old school methodology we talked about later, kind of operating behind it. The software-based immutability gives you faster recoverability in most events, so you'll be able to get back up and running faster. But the hardware level immutability will give you that recovering option if, just in case, that exploit comes out that we didn't know about that makes the software immutable solution not viable.
Yeah, I think multiple layers of immutability is really the key point there, right, John? We got another great question that just came in from Mark, and this is very relevant to what we're talking about with collapsing your networks in the event of an attack and having the ability to do that. And his question was, would you suggest trigger events and or utilize cloud functions to automate and or collapse hybrid cloud environments? And so the one thing I would really caution on with any level of automation and collapsing is if I'm the bad guy and I find out that you have something like that in there, I can actually trigger false positives, and I can almost issue a denial of service inside of your network that will keep re-triggering based on that automation. I do like the idea of automation, but I like to be in control of the big red button. I don't like the AI to autonomously decide that, hey, let's just shut down that plant, or let's just shut down that side. You can do it, but there's dangers involved in that as well too, right? So some things I think are best to be in the driver's seat on, and when we're talking about taking out big sections of the network, that is there. But you have to remember, your point is very good, because the speed of how fast I can shut that down is also key. So having the automation and the ability to have that big red button, I think, is also very key. Awesome. All right. So now, John, we've gone through the failover to the cloud. Things happened with our hybrid infrastructure. Bad guys got in there. We failed over. We kept the business up and operational. We went out for the steak dinner with the team because we just saved the day. Everything is running in the cloud. We've gone through the process of eradicating the threat on-prem. We've validated that with our security experts that have been brought in to help us with that. And now it's time to make a decision. Do we stay in the cloud, or do we bring it back on-prem? And so some of the pieces for, bringing it back on-prem are, if we had to do a kind of wipe and reload scenario where all of our hyper-converged infrastructure, hybrid infrastructure we were running, had to be wiped and reloaded for a variety of reasons, now I don't have a seeded copy of that data anymore. So, what are your thoughts on this? I have multiple terabytes that I've replicated up to the cloud now. I'm not just going to snap my fingers and bring that back on-prem. It's going to take time to reseed. What are some options there for organizations when they want to come home, they want to bring that data back?
Well, so unlike the emergency, the original event where you had to basically contain the fire and reduce the destruction and all those kind of things, now you have the option to take a much more controlled, concise, planned approach. So the first thing that I tell everyone to do is identify exactly what you want to bring back and what that looks like. Like you said, it could be 10 terabytes of data or whatever it is. And then have discussion with the business units that will be impacted and align it when it has the least impact on them, right? So say that this is all quality related data and you're bringing it back in, and during that time, quality can't do transactions, they can't do checks. And if quality can't do checks, then parts can't move to shipping or that kind of thing. So you might want to schedule that for a weekend or overnight or that kind of thing. The other point I'm going to mention, and then I'll throw it back to you, Dave, is that WAN speed is key to this transfer up and back. And that doesn't mean that you have to, break the bank buying more WAN speed. If early on in the process, when you had to fail up to the cloud, if you get a hold of your provider, if you tell them what's going on and that you have an event and ask them to help partner with you and temporarily, allow you to burst up or to increase your bandwidth, those kind of conversations, they will often do that. And they'll do it at little to no charge because, they want to have you as a long-term customer, and they know that this is a one-off event and it's a real way for them to shine. Now, I will tell you that if you call into some national help desk where you're getting a level 1 help desk for, say, a national cable provider or something, you're probably not going to have much luck. So you need to kind of establish relationships with account executives at your connectivity providers well in advance of anything happening, so you know who to call and when, and they'll be ready to act. So back to you, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's another gold nugget for everybody. You want to increase that WAN link. You had that conversation with your rep. Your rep is playing ball. You just went from 100 meg to a gig connection or a 5 gig or 10 gig connection. Make sure your firewall is actually licensed for that port speed, because if your firewall that you have is licensed based on the WAN link speed that you have, you're still going to be throttled there. So these are things that you want to think about in advance as you're taking and you're modeling and planning these scenarios. So just make sure that if this is part of your recovery plan, that you're going to make those phone calls. Make that phone call in advance. Say, we're modeling this particular scenario. Is this something you can even do for us? Yes, it is. Okay, great. Go check your firewalls. Go check your infrastructure. Make sure that it's actually supported, because that's the last thing you want to find out is waiting for some type of a license key or a temporary trial license key from your vendor to increase that speed, all right? Most vendors will play ball in the event of an emergency, though. All right, business continuity planning and your hybrid infrastructure. How many DR plans do most organizations have? Most organizations, John, have a single DR plan. It's an all-encompassing single DR plan, and that is probably written 5 to 10 years ago and been updated along the way, similar to the way that you can think of your original version of Active Directory that you deployed way back in the days of Windows 2000, and it had been upgraded to 2003, 2008, 2012, 2016, 19, 2022, and it's had a life of its own over all these years and passed through 30 different sets of hands as, we've transitioned resources. And, I think you really have to come back and reevaluate your DR plan. I think you should actually have a separate DR plan for cyber, because cyber is not the kind of thing that you can just press buttons in a console and you be done with. There's so much more process and policy and procedure and business level and for threat. And so that big piece of it is you should have a separate BCP plan as well that deals with cyber. One for traditional, we've got an impending threat. We know that the power companies told us there's going to be a power outage, and so we can plan for it. That unplanned, unforeseen event and the cyber type threats, I really do believe that you should have two different models here. What do you think, John?
I absolutely concur with you, Dave. That's super important in 2022 more than ever before, because, as I mentioned earlier, you have cyber warfare. You have active threat profiles out there that are not designed like what we dealt with last year and the year before, where they want to maintain something that they can ransom to you, some preservation of your data that's worth money to you, or that they can steal something that they could sell somebody else or whatever. We have new attacks that are designed just to disable and disrupt, right? So they just want to do destruction. So it's kind of like you were talking about earlier with automation. If they learn that they can basically DDoS your network by continually collapsing your network through automation, then they'll do that, because that's all they want, is to take you out of the game. And therefore, you really do need separate plans that deal with that contingency over your conventional disasters. And don't forget about conventional disasters, because they still happen. We're seeing hurricanes like we've never seen before, and tornadoes and rain and all sorts of different conventional disasters that need to be planned for. And one thing I will mention about the business continuity plan, and this is near and dear to my heart, Dave, is that if you're writing the business continuity plan for your organization, I will bet money that in the event of a sustained outage, it will not hold up. And the reason for that is that just like somebody wouldn't ask me to write down all the steps necessary to perform neurosurgery, they shouldn't ask me to perform all the steps necessary to manage logistics for shipping parts to our largest customer, or to manage how we can complete the quality checks necessary to deliver product, because I'm an IT professional. I'm not a quality engineer. I'm not a logistics manager. Okay, I can learn basic things about those, but I really need to sit with those folks and have them tell me, okay, without computer systems, without technology, what are the steps and processes you can follow to at least continue to conduct business at the most basic level, right? Continue to keep us going so that we can generate revenue, so that we can keep people employed, and we can keep our business intact while IT focuses on the DR part and getting us back up and running. If IT writes the business continuity plan, sometimes it'll work in short instances, but I have yet to see the case where it survives a 1 or 2 week cybersecurity downtime event, and the business ends up losing a whole lot. So get out there, engage each department, each business owner or organizational owner, and have them write that plan with you to tell you how they're going to keep doing business while you're recovering from the disaster.
For sure. And John, with that, we've got another great question, and it's just kind of further to the one that Mark had earlier. And he's like, what about MDRs or XDR deployments in your network to help avoid false positives and to have a more deterministic approach in the response? And my answer to that, Mark, is that any time that you can take and have a deep level of network and software integration that the XDRs will give you, it's a definite plus. And also having the ability to software isolate particular segments that could be impacted gives you that big red button at your fingertip. And in fact, John, we're big fans of software-based network isolation, because when you have that threat, that malware, those pieces that pop up, that's got to be the immediate response in today's day and age, is that we are going to isolate that until we figure out what is going on. Something trips that alert. It could be a critical system, John. It could be a server. It could be an executive's workstation. And it's a tough pill to swallow for the business at the beginning. But if that isolation saved the business, trust me, all the executives will be fine with it, because the option of shutting everything down versus one particular system is way better. And don't get me wrong, like, you isolate the wrong person's machine on the network, you're going to take heat in IT. You just need to make sure you have policy, process, and procedure to back that up, and support your security team. Support them, because it's not an easy task to have to isolate the CEO's workstation because something popped up. All right.
Absolutely, Dave. Let me jump in there, just because I really want to add my voice to how much I agree with the statement you made. Remember, what you're telling your organization is we're going to take these actions to limit us to minutes or hours of downtime, rather than delay our response and end up with weeks and months worth of downtime, right? So minutes and hours are inconvenient, but they're survivable. Weeks and months are often not survivable. So like you said, it's going to be an inconvenience, but you just take that approach of, if I see anything, I'm going to isolate, analyze, and then react, right? So I akin it to one of my favorite Canadian actors, movies with John Candy. Anybody that remembers those movies? There was one where a squirrel gets in the house and is running crazy, this psychotic squirrel. Well, if you had that in your house, what's the first thing you do? You start closing doors to get it limited to one room. If you let it keep running through all the rooms of the house, the destruction is far more massive. So like you said, Dave, anytime something pops up, isolate, immediately analyze, and then react.
Oh, for sure, John. And actually, Mark actually just followed up with that with another great point here. And I'd like to relay this one for the entire audience because it actually leads into this next topic that we're going to talk about so well. And Mark's comment was, would you suggest implementing DevSecOps in its entirety within a hybrid environment, a holistic approach for a software development platform? You know, infrastructure as code, configuration as code, encompassing SecOps by using Azure Advanced Security Center, GitHub Advanced Security Mechanisms. And for me, Mark, a lot of these pieces are actually available to almost all of our attendees. And for example, Microsoft Defender for Cloud is part of your Azure subscription. And I'll just speak to Azure as just one cloud. These security features are there, part of your cloud providers. But you need to turn them on. You need to activate them. You need to configure them. They are there. They're available. And the point of changing holistically the way that the organization thinks to coding these applications, where we come back to the developers and say, no, it's not okay to run all of this code on old Windows 2003 IIS servers because you can't figure out how to move it anywhere else. Trust me, with enough determination, anything is possible. I deal with the development teams all the time. And so the business always pushes back on me saying, whoa, that's such a critical application. We can't take down that application. That'll take down the entire business. Well, I'm like, you're kind of sitting on a ticking time bomb here because that is so easy to exploit. And where it actually pops back for the business is where I say, listen, you don't trust me? Go get any external security auditor to come in here, and I want you to look at that Windows 2003 IIS server that's running all of your key customer data, storing credit card information and personally identifiable information on. Oh, yeah, running on a non-SSL connection. Go ahead, get a pen test on that. Not a problem. And then when they come back and they're like, oh, wow, that's probably bad. Can we fix that? Yes, but it's going to be painful. Some of these things are not easy to fix, but they're things that we can definitely work our way through. All right, so John, advanced persistent threat protection, cloud protection, all of these things are, at our fingertips, but we have to be willing to make the investment as a business. Microsoft is making this ever easier for organizations to secure their platform. It used to be that you have to have a high-end, like E5 license to take advantage of all of these premium security features. And Microsoft themselves have actually realized that, a lot of smaller organizations in that up to 500 seat range also need these same levels of protection. So they've actually created separate SKUs to add threat protection and make it available for kind of the masses. But the way that I look at it today, John, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, way back in the day, and you and I have been doing IT for a long time, it used to be way back in the day, you used to say, well, nobody got fired for buying IBM, or nobody got fired for buying these big vendors, right? And the way that I look at it today is nobody is going to get fired for buying too much security in today's day and age. Where you will get fired is where you're going to take and you're going to have the opportunity to implement, and you chose not to because of a cost. Because when the business comes back to you and they say, well, you didn't really explain the threat well enough. If we would have really known that it was this serious, we would have pulled the trigger on that PO. Don't get yourself to that point. And John, you're the master of working with the upper levels and inside of the business. So kind of what are your thoughts on the maximum level of protection that you can provide for infrastructure?
Well, sorry, I'm chuckling a little bit because I don't think there is a maximum, right? You have to do exactly like you said, and you have to layer and layer upon layer, and you have to articulate risk, because exactly what you described is exactly what I've seen happen over and over. Is I've seen IT people who I know went to their bosses, went to their management and said, hey, we have a risk over here. We need to buy this thing. And they said, no, we just don't have the budget for it or whatever. And then when the bad event happens, management forgets that discussion ever occurred. And they describe it exactly as you did, whereas, well, you just didn't articulate the risk properly enough. So some of the strategies that I use when I'm working with the C-level teams, the boards of directors, is I don't just give them a summarization or my opinion. I bring in events from our insurance broker or our auditors, and I say, hey, can you give me a few examples of other customers you've had where their cybersecurity insurance didn't get renewed because of some event? Or can you give me an example of a audit that failed because, proper levels of protection weren't put in place? And I articulate those things to the CEOs and the boards of directors, not in long worded descriptions, but basically like, hey, if you look at this year and our actual insurance broker says that, they have processed claims for $1 billion this year because of security events where malware has been involved. And then I show them data where, I say, okay, of the 100 events that they told me about, 15% of those companies never survived. They did not return back to business, okay? And when you describe those kind of things and you do it succinctly like that, you get that C-level support that says, no, we're going to do this. And in fact, Dave, you know this, I've been pretty successful at this, where I get the C-level support that is actually needed to convince the lower level, the mid-management level, so the department heads, that kind of thing, who are like, no, you're not going to interrupt our production time. You're not going to interrupt our shipping schedules or whatever. It's the C-level execs or the orders from the boards that come down and says, no, we are going to do this. Or like you described earlier, where we talk about isolate, analyze, and react, selling that to the C-suite is so critical in getting it to be able to change the modality and change the mental attitude of an organization at large.
Well, and anybody that works in cybersecurity today, you know that you're not the best friends of a lot of managers inside of the organization, because the unfortunate reality is sometimes you need to make tough decisions. You need to lock out user accounts. You need to say, no, this is the third time you've now done this. You're going for retraining before your account is reactivated. And if the users are not going to abide by the kind of rules of engagement, sometimes, those users find other places of employment, right? Okay, so further hardening our infrastructure, protecting those events that we talked about earlier. I am a huge fan of documented benchmarks and baselines. And one of my favorites that's out there is the Center for Internet Security. Our good friends at Microsoft have done a ton of work coordinating and collaborating with the Center for Internet Security. They provide benchmarks for almost all of your that you run today. And the nice part about CIS is they actually document the why. Why did you make this setting? You gave me a template group policy that configured 255 things. What did this do? What is this going to do to my machines? All of that is documented. They give you backup documentation, Excel spreadsheets, all of that stuff. They give you scanning tools. Recently, in Microsoft's security suite, they've actually got a preview for CIS benchmarks now, John, built right into the cloud-based tools right now, where real-time scan your infrastructure to see how compliant you are against CIS benchmarks, which is great because now I don't even need to load third-party tools. I've already got maybe the advanced threat protection agents on there, and so that's fantastic. The big part about security baselines, though, for everyone is you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Get yourself a test environment, and it can be done. Just watch the settings, watch your infrastructure, deploy kind of in a logical approach, and you'll get through this. It doesn't happen overnight, but what will happen is you'll start improving your security posture as you go. And then when the next audit comes through and you have to compare yourself to the other, 100 like organizations, I want you to be in the top 2 to 3%, not the bottom 2 to 3%. Next finish installs of applications, servers, Active Directory does not constitute security. You need to lock down those settings. Next finish is the enemy. I'm going to make a T-shirt up for that, John. All right. So you talked a little bit about audits, and what are one of the things that the auditors love is they love vulnerability assessments because it gives them kind of a checklist that can drive what I call actionable change. And so we've got this one and about 4 other topics to talk about, John, so I'll let you quickly talk about what is the relation to real-time vulnerability assessments versus like once a year to your audits? What does this mean to your auditors as they're coming through?
Well, so conventionally, everyone or most people used to operate on hey, we're going to have a yearly audit, and they're going to want to see that we have done at least 1 or 2 vulnerability assessments, right? Whether you call it a pen test or a threat assessment, whatever, but it was an annual or semi-annual event. And now, because of the hundreds of threats that are literally released into the wild every month, sometimes thousands, sometimes they're measured that high, they are providing a lot more positive feedback. The auditors are providing a lot more positive feedback on organizations that take an approach of a constant state of assessment. So they want to see organizations that have implemented process and procedure to whereby they're continually assessing their vulnerability, proposing changes, implementing changes, reassessing, and kind of, lather, rinse, repeat, to use the shampoo and conditioner approach. But that is, I'm seeing a lot more favoritism towards that by auditors than companies that have just done it semi-annually or annually. And those that are still doing it on that infrequent schedule, they're being asked a lot more follow-up questions on, okay, well, since the last assessment, what has changed in your environment and what has changed in the threat landscape, and how do you intend to deal with it, and how have you incorporated that into your BCP and DR plans, and all these extra questions, where those organizations that have taken that constant vulnerability assessment approach aren't getting that kind of level of extra work to do. So you definitely help yourself in passing your audits and saving yourselves extra prove-it type work by implementing that approach.
Well, and where do vulnerability assessments really shine is look at the latest round of 0 days that came out that were available inside of the Windows operating system. Those had to be quickly remediated. There wasn't a quick fix or a hot fix from Microsoft. There was manual actions that needed to be taken to lock those down. And the vulnerability assessment tools that we see out in the field picked those up and gave us a list of systems that we could work through, which was great. All right. We're such big fans of training, John. This is an ever-evolving landscape. Operational cybersecurity training. How frequently should your team be doing cybersecurity training? Not just specifically your cybersecurity team, but the entire team. Is this a once a year, or is this one of those things where you really need to be doing this on kind of a monthly basis to stay on top of threats? What are your thoughts on that, John?
Well, Dave, this is another one where you need to be doing this constantly. For years, we've talked about the necessity of continuing education, and when you're in IT, when you get into IT, you kind of set up for a lifelong learning journey. But when it comes to cybersecurity and protecting hybrid clouds, where you have an infrastructure that spans physical premises and you get into a zero trust architecture and that sort of thing, it's constantly evolving because the threats are constantly evolving. So you really need to ensure that your teams are getting the proper continual level of training. And, Microsoft has done a good job, I think, at creating specific roles and training that target this. But I also feel in organizations that very soon, if you haven't already dedicated resources into just cybersecurity, you're going to find that you're going to need to keep up, right? Simply taking it on as an added burden from the system administration person or the DevOps person, whatever you want to say, that's kind of handling it right now. That's going to leave your organization too exposed. So you're going to find that the organization needs to really kind of peel off and devote money towards a cybersecurity specialist, and then that person needs to take the training that qualifies them for that position, things like the cybersecurity operational analyst position. And, that's an important part of keeping up with the attacks as they're released and the approaches necessary to combat them.
All right. We'll finish up here with maybe two more here. Red teaming and blue teaming exercises. And now we actually add a third one in there, John and I do, with cloud teaming. Your defenses are only as good as how well you can defend in the moment of that attack. And simulating those attacks inside of your environment and understanding how well your processes, policies, procedures, communication plans are going to hold up. The day of the attack is not the time to take and practice that. Like everything, we need to take and we need to practice this type of event. We call them red teaming, blue teaming exercises because we break up and we say, okay, here, we're the bad guys, we're the good guys. You guys are going to try to come in and we're going to try to defend. You can set the rules of engagement inside of there. You can actually model and try a lot of this even inside of a lab environment. You can take a snapshot of your production environment, take it out to a lab, and this will help you have an understanding as to how you need to harden your infrastructure. You also need to look at your cloud infrastructure because if you are in a hybrid world, you are going to have some type of cloud components that are going to be integrated into your production systems, and you need to make sure that those are also taken care of. The big thing that you go through with these exercises, and if you're not familiar with how to run these, there are consultancy organizations that can help you with this stuff. You can take in, the big thing is that once you get your checklist of all those holes, make sure that you actually action those changes and make a difference. This is not an exercise that you would go through just to say that, hey, listen, we've got the checkbox, we've gone through this. And like those discussions with going through the audit, this is something that, cyber insurance vendors, cyber audits, things like that are very pleased with because it's showing that you're actually taking a proactive approach, not a reactive approach to cybersecurity. All right, this is the one where we'll finish up on, John. Unsupported hardware and software and all of the new riders inside of cyber insurance policies. You, my friend, are probably one of the foremost experts on cybersecurity insurance policies that I know. And, I don't know a lot of people that like to read those things cover to cover, but you're one of them. You read them cover to cover and find all that fine print for us. Unsupported hardware and software, those old switches you've got hanging around, the old printers you've got hanging around, the old IoT devices, the old, production network cells, the old servers, the old hypervisors. What does that mean for us in today's landscape? Like what happens if an attack came in and it was deemed to be on an unsupported platform, John?
Well, I hope your bank account is well funded to pay for all the costs associated with the attack because your insurance company will not. I've seen this a lot in the past 24 months or so, and it's just actually getting tighter. So let's kind of walk through this in a quick form. You pay your insurance premium. They ask you a bunch of questions, and IT says, yeah, you're fine. We're all good. and then they get a malware event, right? Like you described earlier, they come in and they've got the printer printing out the weird messages and they can't get into anything and they've got a ransom. Well, the first thing that a lot of IT pros don't realize is that the insurance isn't proactive in its payment. It's a reimbursement type scenario. So whatever the ransom is, odds are you're going to have to write the check for that and then get repayment from your insurance carrier, right? They're not going to just write a check. Now, they will require that they be involved in the negotiations, that they have analysts involved and all that kind of thing, but you're going to have to fund it up front. And then this is where the unsupported hardware comes in. They are more and more doing scrutiny level assessments before they pay out on the claim to ensure that all those attestations you made, all those things you agreed to when you renewed your policy or you got your policy were there. And one of the things that's almost in every major carrier's fine print right now is unsupported hardware and software. And what that means is if you have unsupported hardware or software, you're still running that old XP machine on your network and it's plugged in there, the insurance company can and often will decline to pay out. With hardware, we're seeing a tendency towards a lot of the insurance companies right into the policy a sliding scale on the amount that they will pay based on the amount of time that has passed since a device has fallen out of support or a CVE has been released that has been addressed. You get X amount of time, and then they start cutting how much they're going to pay back on a reimbursement. And unfortunately, I've seen a number of companies where they say, "Oh, we have cyber insurance." They had an event, the insurance company didn't pay out, and it resulted in significant lost jobs. So some of the companies didn't, or organizations didn't survive the event, but those that did lost customers and they lost employees, and it was devastating event because, simply put, they didn't meet the terms of those requirements. So I know we've got a few minutes for questions, so I want to stop there, but I could go on forever, as you know.
Well, you know what? I think if it's okay with Mr. Rammel, we'll take one quick question. I promise I'll be fast on it because I know we've got to get to the next session here. And this one here was just a really good one, and it's very relevant to our session. What type of advice can we give on negotiating with ISPs in the event of emergencies, like having a failover, fail back to the cloud? And I'll take this one, John. It's negotiate in advance. Have those conversations in advance. Don't wait for the emergency that you're trying to track somebody down. Have those negotiations in advance. Plan for, an emergency. Assume breach. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to our esteemed colleague, John. Thank you very much today, Mr. David Rammel, for handing this over for the next session.
All right. Great job, guys. I love the audience interaction.